Tim Butcher is a former Telegraph war correspondent and best-selling author of Blood River. His new book, Chasing the Devil, describes his journey through Liberia and Sierra Leone, where he saw firsthand the impact of violence and poverty on children. I asked him why he had chosen to travel to these particular countries.
Well, I went there because I had an itch, and the itch came from time as a journalist going there and being rather intimidated by both places. I was in Sierra Leone and Liberia during the wars, and they're very tough situations to deal with. Sadly, I felt very unnerved, simply because we just didn't understand where it all came from, where the brutality came from. The purpose of the journey was to go back and really kind of deal with those senses of unfinished business in both countries. What I do is to look forward, I look back, and I find someone who's been there before, who's written about it. And in the case of these two countries, it was Graham Greene, the English author from the 20th century, who had been there in 1935 when he was a young man. It gives me at least a fixed point, so I know what this place was like in the 30s. I can then go now in the 21st century and use that fixed point almost as a reference, almost as a focus, so I can focus on that, and hopefully this swirling image will then come into clarity.
What were you trying to achieve by writing your book?
To try and understand a situation where, children were having their arms cut off in Liberia, where women are raped on a scale that beggars belief, where rebel forces use fetishistic symbols such as, wigs and female clothes. These things bring out the old cliches of Africa. I wanted to achieve this at better clarity, to try and understand a complicated situation and, frankly, give a voice to the vast majority of people whose voices are never heard in a situation like that. You only hear of the rebel leaders, you only hear of the elite. And what I'm so fascinated by is the real people, how they survive in a situation like this, how they build their lives after the war, how a country so scarred by war sets about recovering.
What were the issues you saw facing children in particular?
Well, they were acute. They're at the very tough end of the spectrum because, of course, this is a place where war has gripped for the last 15, 20 years, both countries, Sierra Leone and Liberia, and it's meant that the state as such has collapsed. And without the state providing protection, then I'm afraid, the victims who suffer most are the young, the infirm, and the elderly. So I'm afraid the children narrative from the last 20 years is not good. They have borne the brunt, and of course, if there's one place that is associated with the phenomena of child soldiers, it is West Africa. It's this image of soldiers, children who are reprogrammed, their parents are often killed in front of them, they're orphaned, they're terrorized, and they are re-educated in the worst possible way. But both countries, let's remember, are in a post-conflict situation. They are officially at peace. Now my question is, to what extent has peace been entrenched? And the sad truth is that in the cities, the rights of children are very, very difficult to protect in a situation. The country's governments are so weak still, so broken, that they don't provide what you would expect. Education suffers, schools don't function, NGOs take up a lot of the slack. But what happens when you then go back to your community, when you have no jobs? The children, of course, are under huge pressure to take the slack, and that means working. That means leaving school. That means working in the fields. And I learned on this journey an astonishing respect for, or a different understanding of what it means to work the field. In West Africa, there are no fields. The fields are areas where the jungle has been literally burnt away, and you've got scraggy ground with rocks and half-felled trees and half-burnt roots. And the sheer process of planting rice, of bringing it through to harvest and then gathering it, it's beyond backbreaking, and children take up a lot of that work, and that means that they are physically, they suffer hugely. But the actual state, as I say, is largely broken by conflict, and that leaves the children and the women and the infirm and the elderly and the pregnant very, very exposed.
What was being done to improve the situation of children?
Well, there are different community projects. There are certainly attempts are being made to build schools and return normality. I remember coming across this scene out in the bush in Lofa County where a structure was being built out in the bush, and I asked what it was, and they said proudly it was a school, and it was a school in the barest sense, which is open-sided, thatched roof, wooden-framed structure, and it was almost like the community wanted to return to some degree of normality, so they thought they needed a school. But the school would have absolutely no infrastructure, no blackboards, no benches, nothing to sit on, just a thatched, shaded area. One thing that was helpful and important for young children especially was clean water, and wells. Covered wells are the key, because of course if you have open water sources, streams and rivers, that's where parasites can gather. But if you dig down to a deeper water source, and then importantly cover the well, so you just have a pump sitting out of a concrete cap, then that allows your water source to remain clean. And that's a step forward, a huge step forward.
Did you see any projects to rehabilitate former child soldiers?
The key with a child soldier, with anyone who's been through this, is to talk about it, and then to give them something to take them away from that old reality. It's very hard to bring someone who hasn't talked about it and has seen horrors out of their shell. So you need to be able to talk. You also need to give them an alternative to the lifestyle they led. Remember, they are often orphans. And even if they're not orphans, their families might not want them back because of what had happened. So vicious was the fighting. So they need a job. And one project was to provide jobs in the form of training to ride a motorbike, and then providing them with motorbikes. Motorbikes might sound banal, but they are key, because that gives you a livelihood, because you can then become a taxi driver. All through West Africa, along jungle trails, you would come across little motorbikes with a bloke riding it, invariably a bloke, and then on the back 1, 2, maybe even 3 passengers. And that would be a source of income for the rider. So that was a project, and it was definitely helpful. And efforts were being made, there's no denying, but the scars are terribly deep in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and the children bore those scars very, very directly. They were the cohort, you could argue, who suffered more than any, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Can you tell us a bit more about your book?
The book I wrote about the journey is called Chasing the Devil, and it uses the device of telling my story of my journey, but only as a device to get into the much more interesting journey, which is the journey of Sierra Leone and Liberia. It's about, as I said at the beginning, me getting a better understanding of these complicated places. I certainly did through the journey, and I hope that the book would give readers a better understanding of complicated places and wider issues that touch way beyond Sierra Leone and Liberia, right across Africa, and indeed right across the world.
UNICEF is working in both Liberia and Sierra Leone to protect the rights of children. We're reintegrating former child soldiers with their families and communities. We're getting children back into school. We're providing water and sanitation facilities in communities. And we're helping to re-establish basic healthcare for women and children. To find out more, visit www.unicef.org.uk. This is Andy Brown reporting for UNICEF UK.